Well, my first guest tonight is Bradley Bowman. He is the Senior Director of the Center on Military and Political Power at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. He's also served as a National Security Advisor in the U.S. Senate, and he's a former Black Hawk chopper pilot. Bradley, it's good to have you back on the show. Let's look at what's happening right now in Ukraine. Can Ukrainian forces, can they defend the rest of the eastern Donbas region, or will they have to withdraw? What do you say?
Thanks for the opportunity to join you, and thanks for the question. Well, I sure hope they can. Whether they'll be able to or not, I think depends on a number of factors. And as discouraging as it is to see the Russians seizing essentially control of all of Luhansk, I think it was a necessary decision for Kyiv to make, to do this retrograde, this retreat, so that they would have more defensible lines. But what we've been seeing really is a war of attrition that's been characterized primarily by artillery, long-range artillery. And so that's why the provision by the United States and others of the 155 millimeter howitzers and also the HIMARS systems, the high mobility artillery rocket systems, is so helpful. But we need to get Ukraine a heck of a lot more of those, and we need to continue to resupply them with the ammunition, because the HIMARS system can fire roughly 75 kilometers, and that's exactly what Kyiv needs right now for the coming days and weeks.
Yeah, we heard from an advisor to the Ukrainian president saying that once we get the heavy weaponry that we need, we will push the Russians back. But to your point, how likely is it that Ukraine will get the weapons that it needs fast enough to be able to push back those Russian forces?
It's a great question. A lot of the assistance that the United States has provided since the February 24 invasion has been what we call drawdown authority. And whenever your viewers see that word drawdown, what that means is we're sending Ukraine U.S. reserves. So I support doing that because the stakes are so high there in Ukraine for all of us. But at some point, those reserves either are all used up, or it becomes dangerous for us to provide so much of that. And so as those drawdown authorities are depleted, we have to start putting things on contract and having things built by us and our allies in Europe. And that takes weeks or months, even years. And so, we can and should do more on HIMARS, on counter battery radars and munitions and these sorts of things. But unfortunately, I think it's only going to get harder rather than easier the longer time goes on.
Well, if that's the case for the West when it comes to providing help to Ukraine, what about Russia and its capability of defending what it has already taken? I mean, the military apparently has not been hurt much by international sanctions yet. But what do you think things are going to look like in a year's time if this war drags on that long?
It's a great point. I mean, sometimes we focus only on our own problems and we miss that the other side, our adversaries, having problems too. I mean, Russia's getting hit with extraordinary sanctions. They're more isolated than they've been in a long, long time. So they have their own problems. But the battle is in Ukraine. The battlefield is in Ukraine and not Russia. And so we literally have a lot of the Ukrainian defense industrial base being destroyed. And so they're not going to be able to sustain and maintain their Russian Soviet origin equipment. That's why it's so important that the U.S. and our European allies be looking around the world for other sources of Russian and Soviet equipment that can be provided. And our research at FDD suggests there's a whole lot of places we can find that, while we simultaneously try to, over time, transition them to NATO weapons that we can more effectively sustain and maintain, and frankly, in most cases, is more capable.
Well, you say the United States sending weapons to Ukraine. Almost everything that is being sent in terms of military aid is coming from the U.S. Some is coming from the U.K. Continental Europe, though, the numbers are anemic at best. Doesn't Europe have to pick up here and carry more of a load if we expect Ukraine to win?
Short answer, I would say yes. I don't want to be dismissive of some of the excellent efforts that we've seen. I would highlight the British as one example of a country that really has done quite a bit. I was very disappointed with Germany's policy towards providing arms to Ukraine pre-invasion. Thankfully, they changed that. But I mean, the broader theme here is that our valuable European allies really have to continue to step up for the long term. And when you still have 20 of 30 NATO allies not spending 2% of their GDP on defense, that's going to be a problem.
And let me ask you about what we heard from the president of Ukraine, Zelensky, calling for reconstruction to begin now and not after the war is over. You know, you as a military man, do you think that this is even feasible, or would it be sensible? Is it sensible to rebuild while Russia is still attacking parts of the country?
You know, if I were Zelensky, and let me just say, you know, what an extraordinary and brave leader he's been as I sit here in the safety of the United States, you know, I would be calling for the same thing, right? I mean, in some parts of the country, you probably can start rebuilding, but we're not talking about a weeks or months thing here. We're talking about years and years and years. I mean, Vladimir Putin is really destroying two countries. He's destroying Russia and Ukraine. And so, yes, we should do what we can to help Ukraine rebuild. But meanwhile, we continue to have things destroyed. So if I had to prioritize one of the two, I would prioritize giving Ukraine the weapons it needs to defend against this unprovoked invasion. But if there are things we can do to help them rebuild, sustainably rebuild, then let's get those started. But it's going to be a long, long effort. Yeah, and you bring up a good point. Rebuilding will be an effort for Ukraine, but also for Russia once this nightmare is over. Bradley Bowman, as always, we appreciate your time and your insights tonight. Thank you. Thank you. Well, my next guest is Libor sabuska. She is the Deputy Director of the Hybrid Warfare Analytical Group of Ukraine Crisis Media Center. She's also an advisor to the Ukrainian government. Ms. sabuska, it's good to have you with us. I want to ask you, starting out with about what another advisor to the Ukrainian president said today, looking at the loss in Luhansk. The advisor said that weapons from the U.S. are arriving. The victory in Luhansk for the Russians will be the only Russian victory in Ukraine. Do you agree?
I think that victory in Russia's victory in Luhansk and Donetsk, it's, you know, maybe we lost the battle, but not the war. We now conducting the defending operations. And obviously, we need to go offensive and we need to get more weapons. And that's what we expect to get from our Western allies. Russia currently managed to get Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, as you said. And believe me, after a few months of very heavy, very hot combat, to get just these small two towns, it's not victory for them at all. And also, Russia's losses is extremely, extremely high. They lost more than 4,000 people.
But the losses for the Ukrainian side are at least estimated to be much, much higher. Are you saying, though, that capturing cities like Lysychansk... Well, let's talk about what we know in terms of the cities. We know that the city of Lysychansk has been taken by the Russians. Is it going to be harder for the Russians then to take more territory if they want to keep control of a major urban city like Lysychansk?
I think that now what we see, Russia is regrouping their troops. Now the threat is coming from southern regions, southern directions, particularly Mykolaiv. And also threat is still there in Kharkiv. So obviously Russia will try to stay there. But again, Russian forces brought so much destructions to Lysychansk and Severodonetsk that it was basically nothing to defend there. So, but Ukraine withdrawal of troops was pre-planned, and we managed to take beneficial positions for us.
Do you see the Ukrainian military in a holding pattern right now, waiting for these weapons to arrive, most of them from the U.S.? Once those weapons are in the hands of Ukrainian forces, will they then be able to push the Russians back into Russia?
Absolutely. If we get more weapons, then we can go offensive. So we need more artillery, we need more rocket systems, we need armed vehicles, we need more weapons to get rid of Russian troops from eastern and southern regions.
Okay, Libor sabuska, an advisor to the Ukrainian government. We appreciate your time and your insights tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.
And Domitilla Sagramoso is a Russia foreign and security policy analyst from the Department of War Studies at King's College London. She joins us from Rome. Welcome to DW. Can we start with those Russian territorial gains in eastern Ukraine, where it's deployed so much firepower? Can Ukraine defend the rest of the Donbas region, or will they have to ultimately withdraw?
Well, what is really interesting is how strongly they have defended the rest of the sort of Donetsk Oblast so far. I mean, there have been hardly any advances of Russian forces in the rest of the Donetsk Oblast. So far, they've been really very good at holding any Russian attack. They have very good defensive positions. So one could expect that for some time these regions might not fall. But of course, Russians now may feel that they have a momentum after taking control over Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, slowly moving forward, as you mentioned, attacking Sloviansk and also advancing on the Bakhmut-Sloviansk axis. So there is the possibility that the Russian forces advance further. But it's also important to note how much the Ukrainians are also hitting behind the lines. There have been attacks on ammunition depots, on infrastructure, on airports, in the areas of Melitopol, also in Kharkiv Oblast, also in Donetsk Oblast. So there are many areas where the Ukrainians are also able to hit, very, very much deep in the areas that are under Russian control. And also right. Russia, yes.
No, it's interesting what you say there, because we're talking about a sort of grinding war of attrition. Are we, do you think, looking at an eventual stalemate, a frozen conflict? And could this perhaps be what Russia's actually aiming for?
I think we're a bit far from what we call a frozen conflict. I mean, that would require some kind of ceasefire agreement, and at the moment there is no negotiation on some kind of ceasefire or armistice. Neither of the two sides is ready to give up the territory that they lost or that they have acquired with a lot of effort. So both sides still really want to move forward, and the Ukrainians to retake the land they lost, and the Russians to retake or to take control again of areas that the separatists had achieved or had conquered in 2014 with Russian support. For example, the city of Sloviansk, Kramatorsk, that are really bases of the Ukrainian armed forces. So I really don't see now at the moment the possibility of any immediate or sort of some kind of ceasefire.
Right.
It is true that yesterday President Putin was talking about giving the Russian troops some respite. So we might see some regrouping of the forces, but the artillery attacks are continuing. And what is really interesting to note is also the advances of Ukraine in the south, in the Kherson area. Slowly but surely they are also advancing. And also what would happen if they receive additional equipment, because we are noticing that in terms of artillery, what their Ukrainians are receiving from the West might not be significant in terms of numbers, but it is very powerful. They're really able to hit at ammunition depots, as I mentioned earlier. And
could we just turn briefly to another focus of your work, which is security and development. So let's talk about the Ukraine Reconstruction Conference that's just ending in Lugano in Switzerland. I'd be interested in your thoughts on the so-called Lugano principles that have emerged: reform, democratic participation and transparency.
Yes, I think this is one of the key elements, but this has always been present in many of the programs of assistance by the European Union and, for example, the International Monetary Fund. They've also really tried to make sure that there is increased transparency, that there is effort to avoid corruption. As we know, before this massive outbreak of war, there was a lot of pressure on Zelensky to tackle the corruption of the oligarchs, an effort to sort of ensure that there is a more independent judiciary system, that there is an effective, transparent and democratic accountability. So all this is not new, but it's very interesting that this is really made part as a conditional element for the assistance. But what is also very interesting is that it is made clear that the Ukrainians also are going to be sort of in command of the process. So we are going to give also the Ukrainians some agency, and that really is to be seen to what extent this is going to work. But I think it is important. It sends a clear message. It will satisfy many in Ukraine. The fact that there is commitment to a transformative process that really brings Ukraine up to European standards, and that would also satisfy European member states who might be very anxious about sort of assisting such a big country as Ukraine, which requires quite a huge number a huge amount of aid. I mean, it has been pointed out by the Ukrainian Prime Minister, the figure of 750 billion euros. So that's a really significant figure, probably staggered over many years.
Right.
So what would be important to note is how much countries are going to actually commit once the reconstruction process gets fully underway.
Good talking to you. Thank you so much for joining us and speaking so clearly, guiding us through that so clearly. Domitilla Sagramoso, a Russia foreign and security policy analyst from King's College London. Thank you.